Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and that was a little odd. As I was saying, I want to talk about the chainsword from Warhammer 40k, or 40,000, 40k. 40-something. Now, specifically, what I want to look at is how practical and useful would this weapon be in real life if it actually existed? And there's a couple of things that we do need to take into consideration when we're endeavoring to analyze this really cool pop culture weapon. And the first one is, I guess, the properties that exist in its fictional universe compared to the real world. We can't really transfer certain elements like the materials it's made out of and stuff, but we can try and figure out how those things would affect it if it really operated in real life. So I'm going to look at, could we make, like if you were to get a chainsaw and turn it into a sword, how effective would that be just with our normal technology? And then, how effective and realistic and plausible would one be with certain science fiction properties that they're able to give the Warhammer version, which, for instance, the tooths are made out of a monomolecular material, which is actually a really cool thing. Now, not all of them are, but only some of them are. And the other thing to mention is that in Warhammer 40k, there's quite a lot of different chain sword-like weapons, okay? There's one on, like, a polearm, okay? There's ones on the end of their guns, like a bayonet kind of thing. I just want to look at the classic and iconic standard version, okay? The chain sword used by the Space Marines. So to begin, just looking at standard real-world technology, keeping the, fact that Space Marines are genetically enhanced and also have power armor to give them really good strength, so the weight issues wouldn't be a problem. If we would just look at the real-world mechanics, okay? Take a chainsaw and turn it into a weapon. Would it be a functional weapon? Well, I mean, to what level of function? It would be deadly, that's absolutely sure, so that's a level of functionality. But how maneuverable would it be in, say, combat? Because this is an important thing, okay? The speed in which you can strike your opponent is a very significant element to consider. And in the real world, like, decently sized chainsaws are pretty darn heavy. There's a reason why they have two handles for them. It's not to say you wouldn't be able to use one one-handed, but it would be very cumbersome and difficult. There are lighter versions, and okay, maybe if you got a lighter one, but then how strong would it be? So those are issues to consider. Now, say if you were fighting someone with a regular sword and you had a chain swordy-like thing, even if you just had a regular chainsaw and you were doing a two-handed thing, who really has the advantage? This is interesting because as soon as the chainsaw hits your opponent, depending on if they're wearing armor or not, it's going to be doing damage. But the question is, how easy would it be to hit your opponent in this instance? It doesn't have much reach, okay? And so if someone is using a regular sword and does, a long point kind of stance to keep your opponent at bay, they don't want to engage the actual chainsaw thing because it obviously will damage the sword to some extent, but not completely, because chainsaws, they have trouble, all right, cutting through metal. And I'm thinking of like the diamond-tipped ones, but that's really grinding actions. No, regular chainsaws can't cut through steel unless it exists online. Chainsaw cutting steel. Steel cutting chainsaw. Well, there you go. Oh, is it? I mean, you never know with the internet, okay? Well, it's a very slow process, and it's obviously purposely made for this thing, and it's even got water on the blade so it won't overheat. So, of course, I mean, there are issues. It's possible, but in a regular just clash between a sword blade and a chainsaw, it's not actually going to chop through the sword, because just like even with a regular chainsaw that's not made to cut through metal, just wood and stuff, you need to hold the chainsaw on the material that you're cutting and continually push, okay? It's a slow, and when I say cut, it's not really cutting, it's sawing, and a saw action is quite different to a cut, okay? A sawing action is actually removing material, where a cut is using pressure on a very, very fine point to separate and force apart material. I'm going to get more into that later, because I think this kind of idea, the sawing versus cutting, actually has an interesting mechanic in combat, but you do need to incorporate some of these fantasy sci-fi elements to make it more practical. In real life, swords can do devastating cuts cuts very quickly, even cutting people like in half, limbs off and everything like that. If it's a hefty enough sword and you get a good strike, the cutting action is quick and the result is devastating. With a chainsaw, on the other hand, you need to land the strike and then hold it on the... Jeez, I'm picturing like horror movie like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it needs to be held onto the opponent and pushed in. You don't often get huge, opportunities to do that when someone is actively trying to defend themselves with a weapon and even say armor or shield or something like that. Now, of course, the response is you don't really need to hold the saw onto a opponent very long to do some pretty devastating injury, okay? The cutting and sawing action, ripping out, material could easily incapacitate someone with just a solid strike and it just goes for even half a second. That can be enough. It won't really chop someone in half, but it can be so devastating that actually might stop your opponent from defending themselves, which will then give you time to finish the job. But the trick is to land the strike, and because this is a heavier, cumbersome kind of weapon, I actually think it'll be quite difficult, especially if you don't have reach or any other kind of advantages in that regard. Even if you were to change the way you held this weapon into a sword-like configuration to get a bit more grip, it would be very top-heavy and very difficult to use. Alright, so now let's look at the more sci-fi fantasy version of it, where it actually takes into account some different properties, like the people wielding them having superhuman strength thanks to genetic engineering and the power armor, and the fact that these blades can have the sword, tooths can be made out of monomolecular material, and that basically means that the tips of these, saw blades are a molecule thick. That's a bit crazy already, but they're actually made out of a special type of technology that as soon as they get blunted, they're made out of like a regrowing crystal or something. As soon as they get blunted, they regrow to that single molecule thickness, so they basically can't get blunted. That's very significant, because that basically means this saw would be able to chop through anything. Remember how I was saying, it's difficult chopping through metal with a regular saw, but it can be done, but it's slow, and you have heat issues. If this thing can just gouge into any material thanks to these sawtooths being so darn sharp, and it can just remove it, well, it's not going to run into much resistance. The next thing that's going to affect its speed in cutting is the speed in which the chain rotates. We are kind of limited with technology in the real world, but in a sci-fi setting, this, chain blade could be rotating at an unthinkable speed. So that means it wouldn't be a slow cutting action. This thing could slice through something really quickly because you don't need to wait for the chain to continually remove material. Just going, it can be really, really quick. So the question then, it's effective, it would work, okay, especially with sci-fi technology. Would it actually be better than a regular sword? Because you could make a sword, and in, Warhammer 40k they do, out of this I can't say the word! Monomolecular material. And I mean, they even have power swords as well, which are basically made out of, well, they're kind of similar to my own version of a sci-fi sword, but theirs actually have like heat involved in it. But anyway, it's an energy sword essentially. Not like a lightsaber that burns things away. It does function on a more cutting mechanic, which I prefer, but I won't go into too much detail there. It's kind of the comparison, what would be better? A sword that's really super insanely sharp, made out of basically an unbreakable material, or a chain sword? Well, the first thing would depend if it's painted red or not, and if an orc is using it. Because of the universal truth that red things just go faster. But alright, putting that aside, okay, let's just look at the mechanic. You see, in pop culture generally, not just in Warhammer 40k, there is this misunderstanding that sharpness is what you need to be able to chop through anything. Now, it's part of it, okay, it's quite an important part, and if you can maintain that edge, because the other problem is when you strike something with a sword, not only do you need to worry about edge sharpness, you need to worry about edge retention, because as soon as it impacts something, it's going to start to get blunted. If you can solve those two issues, okay, that's going to help. But there's another really significant thing that sci-fi, anything that focuses on cutting, like for instance Wolverine's claws, okay, they supposedly can chop through anything because unbreakable material, so they don't get blunted and super insanely sharp, yet still they don't take into account something very important that is a factor that needs to be considered even in the real world with swords made out of regular steel, high quality steel, but this is still an important thing to that swords encounter and have to deal with. It's the thickness of the blade itself, because however thick the blade is, that's the space in which the material that you're trying to cut through needs to be pushed apart. Now, when it comes to either spongy or even flexible material, so flesh, a bit spongy, it can be pushed aside fairly easily, but bone, when it's not dead, okay, when it's actually living bone, it's a bit moist and has quite a bit of flex in it, and so it can be pushed apart. This is the same with wood, but wood, you do start to run into some issues because it has a certain level where it will just wedge that blade in. This is why when you strike something, okay, wood is not stronger than a sword steel blade, so it's only going to blunt that edge very, very minutely. But still, swords get stuck in wood when you try and cut. It's not because of the sharpness that they're getting stuck, it's because of the thickness of the blade and the wood pressure wedging the blade in. So you could have a sword made out of an indestructible material, okay, that is sharpened to a molecule thick, and it would still get stuck in a tree if you try and chop a tree, you know, of any significant size in half. So one way to fix this is by making the blade incredibly thin, okay? If you can make it to, like in my own sci-fi sword version that I made, and I actually explain it when I'm explaining the problems with lightsabers video, the blade is basically a few molecules thick, but it's thick enough so the molecules can't kind of just reconnect once they're separated because of the pressure and the cutting action, but it's so thin that it just goes through without any resistance. So that's a cool mechanic. But another way to fix this is actually the chainsaw idea.
This tree's a heretic. Cut down the trees, brothers.
Okay, a chain sword would solve the issue because unlike a monomolecular sword that would have the same issues of getting jammed in things, the chain saw isn't trying to separate something in a cut through pressure on a very fine edge. It's actually just going to remove the material that's in the way. It's sawing it out of the way, literally. This means the chain sword would not get stuck in any type of material, no matter how strong that material is. And because it's made out of such an insanely sharp and unbreakable, you know, sawtooth things, it doesn't run into any material that it can't cut through. And if the chain blade is spinning fast enough, it's not going to be slowed down by the fact that it needs to wait for this material to be removed. It'll be removed really quickly. But there is an issue that would come as a result of this, okay? If this chain blade is moving so fast that material, and remember, it's like, depending on how thick these chainsaw blades are. Now, I know in Warhammer, they're restricted by the size of the models, and so the blades actually look much thicker than what they are. But even in looking at art, the chainsaw blades look significantly thick, and so even if it's half a centimeter to a centimeter to even an inch, anything like that, that's the space of material in a line that is going to be removed out of any target. Where is that material going to go? Well, that'll depend on which way the chain is spinning. If the chain is spinning in this direction, okay, a clockwise direction, the actual attacking part of the chain blade is moving towards you. That means the material that's getting cut out of any target is going to be splattered towards you on your legs, and you get pretty darn messy. Would that affect Space Marines? Probably not, okay? Not really, but actually, if you're cutting through metal, and these are tiny flakes of, and like, metal armor, the armor in Warhammer 40k is also really advanced, so this metal is like really hard, solid stuff, and because of the, you know, spinning blade, the material that's being sawed out of the target, it will be getting ejected at a very high speed. Could that damage the armor? Probably not, it's probably too small, but if they're not in armor, and they're attacking something that is in armor, and you have these tiny flakes of metal being, like, literally shot at you at really high speeds because of the speed of the spinning saw blade, that could actually injure you quite significantly. So, how to fix this? Another option is to reverse the spinning motion, have the saw blade spin counterclockwise, and so the actual striking motion, the blade is spinning up. Two other things actually come in, I guess, you need to consider when thinking of a saw blade as a weapon, and that's the way in which the blade, the weapon, would get pulled depending on which way the chain is spinning, especially if it's spinning super fast and there's any measure of resistance. There wouldn't be too much resistance, but there still would be a measure, okay? And so if the blade is spinning clockwise, regular, it's going like this, as soon as you strike someone with this sword, you're going to feel the blade try and pull forward, and you need to pull back against the chainsaw that's digging in, cutting out the stuff, sawing out the material to actually do the cut properly. And there is a chance that it could get pulled out of your hand if you weren't a Space Marine that wasn't super strong. So I guess that's not really an issue. But you could simply reverse the angle of rotation, and instead of getting pulled out, the feeling or sensation is that the blade would get kind of pulled in to your grip more because the blade is moving that way, it's cutting, and it's being pushed in. But another problem that would come out of this is that the opponent would feel the same directional kind of momentum that the chain blade from the chain sword is imparting onto them. And so if it's spinning clockwise, they would feel like getting pulled in, which is actually a very powerful tactic, okay? This blade is moving so fast, as soon as you strike someone and you're able to land the strike and hold it onto them and they can't move their way, this sawing action will either push them down or pull them towards the opponent, and if they have like spikes on the end to stop them when they get stuck on the edge of the blade and then the sawing motion just continues, that could kind of trap someone in the actual strike completely. And so there's kind of things to consider. If it's a reverse motion, you could push people away and give you room. So maybe if you could have, this is advanced technology, and so maybe there's a way for the blade to simply just flip, okay? So the motion can be changed to the preference of the user. But ultimately, with this advanced technology, the chainsword is a very devastating and effective weapon. If you've got the strength to overcome its weight, it would not run into the issues that would actually exist if you were trying to use a regular sword that was just super strong and super sharp. It wouldn't get stuck in any of the material you're cutting. It would saw through it, which means it is a very devastating weapon. And it would get through some really powerful armor, because again, just reiterating that point, a super strong, super sharp sword chopping that, can penetrate Space Marine or whatever, Eldar, any opponent's armor, it'll actually get jammed because this armor is super strong and it'll just problems, eh? So there we go. Chainsword. Plausible. Devastates, nasty, but in the real world, again, issues because of weight. So these are my thoughts on the Warhammer 40k chainsword, and there are some really unique things to consider about it, which answer problems that just generally exist with sword use. So there we go. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed. If you've got any thoughts that you'd like to share, please do in the comments below. Really look forward to reading them. Hope to see you in the next video, and until that time, farewell.